Hi, beauties. Thank you so much for tuning in. Today, I will be sharing some thoughts around demystifying anxiety. So anxiety it's just running rife. I don't know of anybody who hasn't experienced it at some point in their life, whether they've been able to acknowledge that or whether it's something that, has been avoided because we have these mechanisms. We tend to try and outthink our way out of anxiety. So it really is reflective of the state of the world. We're in this kind of constant state of hypervigilance, fight or flight. There's always something that makes us feel unsafe in ourselves. And often, social anxiety is a really big thing. I know I used to have that a lot, and I never acknowledged it. I never explored it. I just, I'd use alcohol and other stuff, or else I would simply think my way through it, and I would, mind over matter. I wouldn't look at what was happening in my experience in my body and the butterflies and the tension, and nor would I look at why in this situation do I feel so nervous, or at the very basest, it's a sense of safety and not feeling safe. And that's because our nervous system is reacting to something based on a past pattern or a past imprint, maybe a past experience or a trauma of some sort. And we're stuck in this cycle of reactivity because we never were able to resolve that initial experience. And that can be something that's stored in our DNA, like it's an ancestral trauma. Maybe it's something from our soul's journey. Maybe our soul brought that into this body to experience this life. And maybe it's something that happened at a younger age. So there are a number of different sources of this, these imprints, which cause us to become reactive and which cause our nervous system to become dysregulated in this way. And what I want to do today, without going too much into the stories, is to just share with you a simple process or methodology for re-regulating your nervous system, but also moving beyond to try and stem that cycle. Because, when we do what we've always done, we get what we've always got. And so if our pattern has always been to, if we notice a reactive pattern, or more so if we haven't noticed the reactive pattern, we develop a usually a fixed response or a habitual response, and that just becomes part of our personality. Often it becomes part of our egoic self, and this forms a limitation. And as humans, we're limited only by these imprints and our beliefs or false beliefs that are coded into our subtle body, our body consciousness, our subconscious. And this is what we project in our experience of the world, or when we're reacting to the world, our sense of safety or not, as the case may be. So, when we start to acknowledge that we live most of our lives in a reactive state, and we try and protect, and, we're trying to protect ourselves from experiencing some perceived threat or some perceived danger or discomfort which may have occurred in the past, we can acknowledge that our reactions are no longer a good match for the experiences we're having. So whilst something may have happened in childhood which warranted a particular fight-flight response, when we notice ourselves as an adult having that same physiological reaction of not feeling safe, needing to protect ourselves, getting defensive, yet when we can notice that we're doing that, we can actually notice where we need that healing and where we can start to take back control and power of our experience of life. We don't need to continue to relive that fear, relive that pain, and relive that trauma. But it does mean that we will eventually need to go back and to allow the body, the mind-body-spirit complex, the whole of our being, to process the original fear or the original pain, which we didn't have the capacity to deal with at the time. So, the physical feeling of anxiety as a nervous system response. We release the chemistry, things like what is it, cortisol and adrenaline and things like that. And it feels really uncomfortable. Interesting thing to note is that the physiology of anxiety is reflective also of the physiology of excitement. And so to that extent, we can say, okay, well, how are we framing this? How are we framing the experience that one occurs as a terrible threat to our safety, and it's really uncomfortable, and another perhaps is something that we're eager to live into, the unknown. And it is really, that's the similarity between the two, is that we're looking at an unknown situation, and on the one hand we're trying to protect ourselves, on the other hand we're trying to live into it. Anyway, I digress. So yeah, as I said, if we don't deal with these reactive patterns and the trauma response, if we think it's just what we're destined to keep experiencing, then nothing will ever change. But and my desire in this video is to give just a better understanding. This is not a clinical study or a clinical paper on the various attributes and aspects of handling your anxiety. Anxiety occurs in many degrees and with many nuances. Sometimes it does occur in that sense of anxiety, excitement, and sometimes it occurs as a crippling experience of something that we're afraid to see, or also a crippling reaction to some kind of perceived threat, which in all reality usually is no longer a threat at all. It's simply the remnants of an imprint that was formed at some point in our past when we didn't feel safe. So I want you to feel resourced. One of the biggest gifts that we can give ourselves is the feeling of safety in our own being. Safety isn't something that's given to us from outside, especially when we're talking about social anxiety. Our safety comes from resourcing ourselves from within. So, with a respectful acknowledgement that we all experience different things in different ways and to different degrees, I want to just introduce 4 aspects, or 4 facets, 4 dimensions of how we can approach the experience of anxiety in a way that can perhaps help you to feel less overwhelmed and more able to not just self-soothe in the moment, but actually move beyond the repeating pattern of reactivity. So these 4 aspects I talk about, and I talk about this with all the work that I do. We've got our mental aspect and our emotional aspect. Now, these are kind of 2 corresponding aspects of the same coin: our thought form, our feelings. And then we've also got our spiritual aspect and our physical aspect, as above, so below. And each of these can play a part. It's not limited to these, but broadly, these are the 4 kind of aspects that we can manage to help shift our reactivity. So the first thing I want to talk about out of those 4 is our physical aspect. And this is because I think until we start to feel resourced with our physical aspect, it's very difficult to explore those higher elements. And that's kind of a natural progression in the self-realization, or in Maslow's needs. We need to feel physically safe. So when our nervous system is in this fight flight, in this flood of adrenaline, all the blood's going to the limbs, whether it needs to or not, we feel really uncomfortable in our body, we can start to shut down. So what can we do to resource ourselves so that physically, we can move again? I know that I had an experience. I was doing a performance, and I was so horribly anxious. I was so my body was just, it didn't want to move at all. And I was about to go on stage, but I felt like my knees were going to give way, and I was doing a dance performance. So and at that point, what was really important to me was breathing, noticing my body, being in my body in the present moment backstage, rather than projecting or imagining looking at the audience, bringing myself back into my physical experience, taking some deep conscious breaths. So deep conscious breaths actually do physiologically soothe our nervous system. So starting to breathe really consciously is a big thing. Movement and touch are two other really powerful ways to help soothe our fight-flight response. Because the response, the physiology of it is actually preparing us to fight or flight or freeze. Sometimes moving around, like you might want to, sometimes I've jogged on the spot, shake your arms around, just move your body around, letting that excess energy move through your system while you're breathing, while you're noticing the feeling in your body. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but noticing how you're feeling. Another alternative, and you'll know what you need at any given time, may simply be to protect yourself. And when I say protect, I don't mean literally from an outside threat. I simply mean go into the fetal, curl up, go into the fetal position, wrap yourself up in your own arms. When we take action to protect our soft underbelly, that can be a very soothing act in itself. It's a soothing posture because, in the wild or primally, when we're exposed, when our center is exposed, we're vulnerable. We could be attacked or, in the wild. So to curl up, to protect ourselves, to wrap ourselves in a blanket can be extremely soothing for our nervous system. And another thing is just soft, gentle touch. It's a practice called havening. And to simply self-massage, really, gently self-massage, breathing deeply, focusing on the feeling of your hands touching your body, focusing on the feeling of safety in your body and the present moment. What's your current experience of this moment? And so that's really bringing a sense of ease and balance into our physical experience, or the physical manifestation of anxiety. And so once you kind of get through that critical period of reaction, we can then start to explore our mental and emotional aspects. And these two aspects work as both a trigger and a solution. So we want to understand it from both sides. So on the mental side of things, actually, no, we'll say on the emotional, because this actually speaks to what I was talking about with the body and bringing some soothing energy into the body. So if we think about feeling, we often think that we feel things, but through our lives, like feeling can be really uncomfortable. If we have felt hurt, or if we have felt rejected, or if we felt threatened, fear at its core. These are fear, functions of fear. And when we feel that in our body, because emotions are felt in our body, it's very uncomfortable. And so we've spent most of our lives trying to avoid that. And so in facing and breaking this cycle of anxiety, we need to be able to feel what we've previously avoided feeling. And so in doing that, there's that typical thing, you feel the butterflies, you feel knots in your belly, are typical descriptions of what we feel when we're anxious. And so the invitation here is to, once you've resourced yourself enough to, to be able to have some level of clear-headedness, is to tune in to the body, to this what I call the emotional center. So from our throats, the vulnerable underbelly. So from our throats down to our lower belly. And just tune in to observe any sensation. Usually it will feel like a contraction. Usually maybe some butterflies, maybe some nausea. I feel a bit nauseated when I'm tuning into the feeling of anxiety. Sometimes it will run down the arms. Sometimes it's just this, I find a bit of a discombobulation. It's kind of like I'm not really here, or I dissociate from my body. But what we're trying to do in bringing the feeling in is to tune into the sensation, which is where that emotional energy is coming from and going to and storing in the body. But it's also now, from this element, we incorporate the mental aspect as well. And so we can start to ask, we say, what is it that I'm feeling? And this is when we might be able to define something. And the ability to define comes from our mental aspect. So our emotional aspect, that's the feeling. That might be the urge to cry, the urge to scream, the urge to run, or whatever we're feeling in our body. But then when we bring our mental aspect in, and I'll go into two sides of this, but we can start to say, what is it that I'm feeling? I'm feeling afraid. I'm feeling angry. I've had a nervous system response from anger because I didn't know what to do with it. And so we kind of go, again, it's this incapacity to feel our emotions. And so when we start to resource ourselves, a whole lot of stuff can come out. But yeah, so we ask ourselves what I feel. What do I feel? What do I feel in the body? And there's a real distinction between what I'm feeling is not what I'm labeling it. So the sensation is not the label. Label comes with the mental aspect. Feeling is the presence, that's the felt sense. So we're in the mind. And we can use this as a means to understand our reaction and to begin to, all too often our mind will be used to avoid, to rationalize, to justify. And that's what we do because it makes us feel safe. It helps us to feel in control. When we can rationalize and justify something, we have a reason for it, which gives it a purpose, which means that we're more comfortable with it. And we can start to look at solutions, or, we make excuses for why we've been mistreated, things like that. And that gives us a sense of control over it, which is a comforting thing. It's a comforting thing, but it's not a resolution. And so that pattern, or that reactivity, or that cycle of reactivity will continue. So we are in the mind. So mental, emotional, there must be balance. For every time I think, oh, I'm really angry, we need to tune into the feeling of that in our body in order to have it clear and move through our experience. Every time we feel something in our body, we need to be able to match that to the cognitive understanding of that emotion. So it's no good to have this nervous reaction response, let it go away, and then just go, oh, okay, cool, it's done, because we've avoided it, we've suppressed it, or we've distracted ourselves from it. When we go through this full process, it allows us to start to attain a sort of mastery over the experience. And I still get the whole inspiration for this talk was because I had an experience of quite acute anxiety it was a kind of an overhang of a previous pattern, which I've worked through. But it kind of came up, and it was really, really quite a potent reaction that I had to nothing in particular. It wasn't a big deal. And so, in understanding this process, it doesn't necessarily mean that snap, everything will stop unsettling us, but it simply means that we're resourced, and we don't need to experience the sense of overwhelm and fear that might have once happened because we don't know what to do about it. You know, so in my experience, I had a little bit of discomfort. You know, I wasn't super thrilled with what I was experiencing, but I knew to sit with it. I knew to feel it. I knew how to be in my body, how to be with the emotion. And then I also knew how to identify with the story. And so again, with that mental aspect, you know, the two key words with the mental is what's the story that's coming up for me and what's the meaning that I'm giving this situation. And when we can understand that, we can start to realize where these triggers are arising from, and we can start to peel back those layers. And you know, what might be our surface thing. So we might say, you know, our story might be that, you know, someone's really mistreated us, or they've got no right to speak to us like that. And in some cases that you know, we do need to have clear boundaries. But often we can become reactive on the perception of something rather than the actual fact. There's this distinction between what actually happened and what's the story I'm telling myself about that. So we in this mental realm, we ask ourselves, what's the story that I'm telling myself about this, and what's the meaning that I'm giving it that makes it unsafe for me? You know, what is it that in this experience that makes my body feel unsafe? And this is when, you know, this is a really deep exploration in itself. So it's not something I'll speak fully into in this video. But, you know, this is how we start to uncover our light and start to empower ourselves, because we have many layers, and to have this compassionate curiosity for what lies beneath the story. You know, we tell the story that we usually have is a story that our subconscious mind created to protect us from being at risk of experiencing some kind of discomfort or pain or rejection or trauma. So that's working with the mental. What's the story I'm creating, and what's the meaning? And when we're starting to use this same realm of self to self-soothe, we can say, how do I want to write the story? What do I want to believe about this situation? And what meaning do I want to affix to it? You know, so as a simple thing, a simple example might be you're walking down the street, you see somebody that you know, and they walk straight past you. And, you know, this might not trigger anxiety, but it might more, you know, you might have an emotional reaction. You might feel rejected. You might feel like they were rude. You might be angry. Everyone responds differently to these things. And so you could go down that path of feeling angry, rejected, they're rude. Or you can go down the path and go, okay, well, that's the story that I've created and the meaning that I'm giving it. How about instead, I'm going to choose not to make a story about it, not to judge them, and allow for the fact that maybe they didn't see me, maybe they were having a bad day, and creating the space for grace, you know. Anyway, that's a bit of a diversion. I wanted to make this a quick video, so I don't know how I'm going. But yeah, so feeling with our emotional body, understanding with our mental body. And those two must go hand in hand in order to create any kind of resolution or moving through. And remember, we have many layers. And so the compassionate, non-judgmental curiosity is key if you want to start resolving and to move beyond the conditioned patterning and reactive patterns that I've spoken about. And finally, the fourth aspect that I talk about is the spiritual aspect. And the very simplest way of referring to that, you know, we talk about our crown chakra, but our spiritual aspect is the part of us that's connected to the divine, the part of us that knows that we are more than our human experience. We are more than our physical emanation. And it implies a level of trust. So when we tune into our spiritual aspect in our spiritual knowing, our divine knowing, we immediately tap into this resource of trust, trusting that we don't necessarily need to control everything. Perhaps trusting that the universe is unfolding as it should, whether that's easy for us or in a more challenging time. And trusting that we are supported and resourced in the way that we will need when we need it. And this can be a really great source of strength and inner strength when we're going through difficult times. But also when I'm contemplating, say, being in an anxious response, like I said, there was that time recently, to just surrender, to go through the process. I went in my body, how did it feel? What was the story? And then to go, well, there's nothing for me to do about it now. There's nothing for me to change in this situation. What was, what will be when I need it to be. And that brings us back to the present moment, and that sort of capacity to not overthink, to not project. Projection's a big thing, but to not catastrophize. And so it's about that connection and that trust and that capacity to surrender. And this is a journey, and it's always a journey, and we cycle through these 4 aspects. But when we do the work and when we start to find more of ourselves, because when I talk about spirituality and the spiritual aspect, that is just you. You don't need to believe in some kind of external deity for that. That's just a greater part of you that is beyond the physical. So, I hope that this has served in some way. I know that when we're experiencing overwhelm and reactive energy in our body, and as I said, it's very nuanced. It can occur in many different ways for many people, but one of the commonalities is that sense of overwhelm, and helplessness. So I hope that this video has kind of helped you to feel a little bit more resourced, to feel a little bit more empowered in the way you experience and encounter moving through life and moving through the world, and also growing, deepening into yourself, because you are an amazing being. You are so strong and so divine and so full of love. And when we can start to resolve the stories and the patterns that have kept us in limitation or in repeating emotional patterns of fear, or just simply not feeling safe, when we can move beyond that, we can start to explore our expanded self. And your expanded self is just amazing. So if you enjoyed this, please do like, subscribe, or leave a comment below. I would love to hear from you if any of this resonated, or if there is anything that you would specifically like support with. I'm always here. You can always email me. So thank you, beautiful one, for watching. And I wish you love and peace and happiness.